are you also a sci-fi guy? Because I think about, as you're describing that, and I'm thinking about putting together these universes fits perfectly in with sci-fi in that as well. I mean, be it Star Trek or Star Wars or Guardians of the Galaxy, they're also building and developing whole universes and whole worlds, etc.
Yeah, well, science fiction and fantasy are allied genres, I think is possibly the best way of putting it. I mean, personally, I don't really see much point in drawing a distinction between the two. I think they're very similar, and they have a lot. I mean, the scholar who came up with this notion of taxonomizing fantasy based on expositional principles, Farah Mendelssohn, she pointed out that immersive fantasy, the arguing of a world into existence, is very, very similar. It's basically what science fiction does, she said.
Yeah, because I mean, it seems that if you just change the characters, I think when I think fantasy, I think witches and warlocks and goblins and for some reason dark forests and spells and that kind of thing. If I think about science fiction, I just think Jedis and spaceships and planets but that seems. The locations seem to be different, but the storylines and the characters seem to be the same.
So it's just an interesting sort of thought experiment. What about a fantasy novel which actually dealt with the emergence of an entirely new religion in England in the early 20th century and the consequences that would have on public perceptions of the First World War?
Well, that sounds interesting.
Yeah, because that's basically something that's what E.R. Edison writes about broadly.
So say that again. It's a fantasy. So other than the characters and the locations, which are fairly obvious in my mind, and I might be wrong, what's the difference really between a fantasy and a sci-fi?
Well, again, I don't really think there is one. I mean, I get that people do disagree with me, and that there are people who observe a very, very strong difference between the two. Actually, I remember once they were listening to a radio interview with René Auberjonois, who was the actor who played Odo in Deep Space Nine, who was asked what it was like appearing on a science fiction show, and he very, very firmly shut the interviewer down and said Star Trek is not science fiction, it's fantasy, because he drew a very strong distinction between the two. And again, I'm not going to tell him he's wrong, but there are so many similarities between the two, and the differences are so marginal. I mean, that.
Do you think that, like, because as a person myself who's much more of a science fiction fan than fantasy, in fact I barely watch any fantasy, but what you're saying is obviously the same sort of thing. Personally, I sort of look at it and say as sci-fi, obviously there's aliens and other planets, but there are often not many science fictions, I can't even think one off the top of my head, that doesn't have Earth and earthly places like New York or Los Angeles or London as being, so Earth is real and then the rest of the galaxy is a fantasy place with aliens and so forth. So
Star Wars.
Except for Star Wars. So
what about Dune?
Yeah, well, June. I haven't. Yeah. And so I'm more thinking of like a lot of sort of modern science fiction. Often, so you look at Star Trek, with especially the reboots and stuff, and things like Stargate.
So you're saying that science fiction has an element of Earth usually attached to it?
A little bit, yeah. I think, and whereas fantasy often is completely, whilst they're bound by the laws of earthly physics, it's sort of there's no Londons and. Well, other than sort of, mortal machines.
Well, what about Harry Potter? What about the search for Grindelwald, whatever that kind of stuff? That would be fantasy.
I'd classify that as fantasy, though, wouldn't you?
Yeah, but that's what I'm saying. That has got the Earth location.
And then again, getting
don't make my argument completely.
getting back to again. I mean, I'm not. I wonder how many people who are going to watch this have read any of E.R. Edison's novels, because again, with the best will in the world, he's not terribly popular.